to Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah. Looks like we're live. Okay.
It's up now?
Yep, it's
Okay,
it's
I'm just
up.
trying to...
Go ahead, yeah.
What's on your YouTube?
Go to the last message that I sent you. You'll find the link to Oriental Despot, which is my YouTube channel, and you can find it there. Ladies and gentlemen who just tuned in, I'm gonna have a conversation with Drew Pavlou. The young Drew has made a name for himself over the past year or so as a vocal opponent of Chinese influence in Australia's universities. Do you think that's
Chinese government influence,
Chinese
not Chinese
government? Okay,
because I make a distinction.
He makes the
Wait,
distinction.
let me post to the Facebook.
Put it up on Facebook. Maybe then we'll start.
Then we'll start. Yeah.
You've got the link.
Yeah, I've got the link, and I'm just posting it now, and I'll also put it I'll also put it up on my Twitter.
Chinese influence in Australia's universities. Do you think that's?
I'll just click it to make sure it's working.
Chinese government, okay.
Because I make a distinction.
He makes the
I'm
distinction.
debating. Let me press to the... So the one I just... Hang on, I think I did the wrong one.
No, did you? You may have. Let me send you.
Okay.
Let me send you the right one.
I've got it. Don't worry.
Oh, you got it.
So this one will be live.
Yeah, sure. Take your time in putting it up.
And then I'll just quickly do it on Twitter too.
Yeah.
Then we can we'll get going.
Yeah.
Good stuff. So have we got any stream viewers yet, or?
Not that I know of. I guess like you're gonna start bringing an audience to me, so. Live debate with CCC supporter and infamous Tanky Jake. I love it. That's great.
It is. You are infamous, so we've got 3 watchers now.
Okay. I feel like you're hosting me now.
No,
it's kind of like that, but that's okay.
We'll post to your Facebook maybe. Just get some tankies in there too, because we don't want it to just be...
Yeah, I'll share it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll say talking to Drew. So talking to Drew Pavlou about China right now.
Good stuff.
But look, I was going to say, I mean, you have made a name for yourself, standing in opposition to the influence of the Chinese government over Australian universities, and then I've seen that kind of evolve into this general opposition to what China does generally, what the Chinese government does generally.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So, do you think that's a fair characterization?
Yeah, so basically I would just probably define myself more broadly as like a human rights activist.
Yeah. Because
for me, it's not really about nationalism, and it's not really about race or borders or whatever. I simply care about the dignity of the human person wherever human beings are facing tyranny, oppression. I care about that. I care about the human dignity everywhere, across all places, all times. And that's why I'm generally opposed to the Chinese government, because the Chinese government is perpetrating human rights abuses on a mass scale. It's on a vast scale.
So liberal universalism, I guess, would be a way of describing your politics.
No, I wouldn't call myself a liberal universalist. So I used to be a liberal, and I think in recent times, probably over like the last 6 months, since all this started happening, I probably have evolved into like more of a democratic socialist / libertarian socialist position.
Well, the socialist part is good. I like that. It's better than liberal.
Because I was originally attracted to liberalism because of its promises of enhancing individual freedom and whatnot.
Yeah.
And my entire issue with liberalism what I came to see was that where it promised individual liberty, individual freedom, it really just, I guess, I don't know,
There
it
is a
just replaced,
contradiction, I think.
yeah, it replaced one form of oppression with another, I believe. So like,
Right, right.
where before it replaced the oppression of feudalism and the tyranny of the monarchy and whatnot with, I guess, like the tyranny of like rapacious market economics.
But here's a
Like,
question I've got for you, right? I mean, how do you decide
yeah,
which causes, global causes, you take seriously and advocate for and use your voice in regards to? How do you
well,
make that decision of like saying this is going to be a priority and this isn't?
see that's a good point because like I guess the criticism that I've faced a lot is like you focus on the Chinese state while like say ignoring Western human rights abuses, etc. What my response to that is that I don't agree. I don't agree with that characterization of my politics because I'm prepared always to criticize human rights abuses when they're being perpetrated by Western governments. So
Hmm.
I'm very happy like condemning Trump's caging of children at the border. I'm
Hmm.
very happy to condemn what I see to be torture camps on Manisan Nauru.
I think I've caricatured your approach towards this in the past, right? Where I've basically said that you you behave as if it's your job to gaze condescendingly upon the world and issue moralist denunciations of individuals according to the crimes that they've committed. It's a kind of looking at the world from like the position of God, and then just condemning.
I don't, but I don't see it as like I guess like I'm coming to it from like this godly place where I'm gazing condescendingly down upon like the mere mortals and condemning. That's not the approach that that's not the approach I'm interested in. My thinking is as a citizen of the world, as someone who like has the privilege to have like as someone who is privileged to be afforded a pretty good education, a stable position in life. I have all these leg ups in life.
What can I ask? What does
Yeah.
citizen of the world mean, right? Because I mean, just the word.
Well,
Here's what I mean, right? The word
I know that
citizen.
I know that's the cringe progressive thing. I don't really like.
I'm not even I'm not even accusing you of
Yeah,
being cringe. I mean, look, you accuse me of being a tanky. I did, associate with Marxist Leninist circles for most of my life, and so internationalism is not new to me, right? But the reason
yeah,
I ask about the word citizen is that citizenship usually implies that you have some control over the state. You have a franchise within a state. Now, you don't have any
yeah.
franchise within the Chinese government, so your criticism of China is as an external agent, not as a citizen.
I disagree though that I have no influence. Like I disagree that an Australian has no influence over the crimes perpetrated by the Chinese government because Australia has a very close economic relationship with China, and as such, we have huge economic leverage over this country.
No,
If we
they have leverage over us. They're the high value added manufacturing producer, and we're the primary commodity exporter.
mm, they do have leverage over us, but we also have leverage over them too because we have very high quality resources that they
It's
depend on
slipping.
to
That's
for
the
their.
thing. I mean, multipolarity is happening. It's accelerating in the direction of the east, particularly China.
Yeah, my perspective though is because the world is so interconnected economically, diplomatically, socially, we do have a stake in what we do have a stake in human rights abuses when they're being carried out by overseas governments,
Fair
and
enough.
we can pressure
Fair enough.
and we can pressure our government, the Australian government, to respond by sanctioning the individuals involved.
Yeah.
So I'm like I want to like make clear when I advocate sanctions, I don't advocate broad sanctions against an economy that will impoverish the ordinary person who's not involved, who can't be
Yeah.
held culpable
Yeah.
for like regimes.
Look, I heard this. I've heard this kind of stuff. By the way, I came back from Syria, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
I mean, speaking about sanctions, I mean, would you say that you're against the economic sanctions on Syria?
It depends what economic sanctions you're talking about, I'd say.
Okay, well, let me tell you
So
something, right? Like,
yeah,
I have a lot of friends in Syria, and what they told me is that prior to the war, The
Yeah.
government had monopoly over the imports of many goods in the Syrian economy. They would then
Yeah.
distribute it to the local small capitalists, right, and then regulate the price for the consumer, right?
Yeah.
Um, so this entire system was turned upside down during the war because the economic sanctions meant that it was no longer that the private business classes depended on the government. The government now depends on the private business classes in order to be able to keep the imports coming in. Because if they do the imports through a government-run, regulated, price-controlled body that offers fair prices to the Syrian people, then they'll be sanctioned because it's associated to the regime, and the regime is associated with Bashar al-Assad. You see what I'm saying? And so what
Yes.
ends up happening is that we experience this. The currency in Lebanon and Syria is depreciating like mad. I mean, officially in Lebanon it's 1,500 to the dollar. Now it's 2,000. The same level of depreciation, 40%, hit the Syrian economy as well. So this idea that sanctions, that you can somehow customize the sanctions that a country like the United States imposes on other countries, you can't. All you end up doing is either manufacturing consent for them or manufacturing consent for their allies in the region.
Look, I don't. Look, firstly, I'd say you can't just blame, I guess, like the depreciation of the Syrian currency and like the devastation of the Syrian economy more broadly. You can't just blame that solely on US and Western sanctions because obviously
Yes,
there's
you
been
can.
so much.
Yes, you can. Look, I was there
No,
for 2
there's
weeks.
obviously been
I was
so
there
much
for 2 weeks.
destruction.
Let me tell you what happened to me, right? I went in with a certain amount of money, right? And when I came out of the country after 2 weeks, within that space of time, the currency had collapsed by about 35 to 40%. Ordinary people suffered
Yeah.
because of it. It's ordinary people who pay the price, right? And you see the effects of that in Lebanon. When you walk through the streets of Beirut in Hamra, right, and you see just tens and tens of Syrian beggars lining the streets, and if you're generous to one, you get followed by all of them, right? And you ask the local people, was Beirut always this crowded, right? And they say, no, we have so many Syrians coming because the economy has been destroyed.
Yes.
So it's
But
it's
surely that
not
economy
it's
was
not.
also
So
destroyed
my
by
point is
Assadist
that
barrel
over
bombs,
the past 2 or 3 months, there's been very little fighting. In fact, over the past year, the fighting is largely diminished. It's only with the Turkish invasion, right? And yet the sanctions still had that economic toll. So when you say you can't blame that depreciation solely on the sanctions, I'm responding to that particular point. I think you're completely wrong.
Look, obviously the Syrian economy has been harmed by sanctions, but obviously the consistent barrel bombing of like cities, the use of poison gas
Drew, come
against
on,
people,
please.
it
Drew,
obviously
Drew.
it obviously destroys the incentive to commerce and trade, etc.
Son,
Like the
like,
economy has also been destroyed by Assad.
Drew. I've studied this conflict for 10 years, right? Like, I've heard everything that you've said. Now, my response towards you, to anyone who brings up these points is to say, what's the driving force behind the war?
Okay, like
This is a very
let's just
important
go.
premise. It's a very important premise.
Just let's go back to the sanctions question though. Like, obviously we can't blame one thing on something as like multivarious as the collapse of the Syrian economy. Like, that is obviously such a complex subject. We can't just reduce it down to simply.
It's the attempt to
sanctions.
overthrow the Syrian state. That is the driving force behind this war. That's why the sanctions were imposed, in order to try and overthrow the Syrian state.
Look, the war started not by people trying to overthrow the Syrian state. The war started when the Syrian state turned its guns on protesters, calling for simple democratic reforms.
What I'm saying is that there are internal and external factors. What you've mentioned are internal factors, but the internal factor simply does not explain the...
Who's the main force trying to overthrow the Syrian regime? Is it the Jews or Israel or... explain it.
I didn't say that.
I know. Explain
you mean internally or externally? Because I wanted to get on the question of internal versus external, right? Because this is important.
Okay, but who's behind this force that is driving?
There's a variety of interests. I would characterize the external interests as the interests of the United States and Turkey these days. It used to be general NATO interests in the past, but now the US and Turkey have split. then you've got the Gulf countries, but then they've split as well. So, for example, Turkey and Qatar are on the same side. Saudi Arabia and the US are on the same side in that particular split. And of course, Israel. Yeah, I mean, Israel has been giving safe haven to the forces that have waged war against the Syrian state. They have bombed.
So
Syria
there were no
300
internal sources of
There
dissent, though.
are
That
internal forces of dissent. I mean,
yeah.
it's definitely true. But if you look, for example, at the total number of insurgents who have been killed in this war, about 50 to 70% of them are foreigners. Okay, now that's very unusual in a civil war. Find me any other civil war in the world where the majority of the forces waging war against the state are foreigners.
Look, what happened was the war started out when internal opposition to the Assad regime was crushed violently, and
was it crushed violently?
Yes, it was, because there were
views about that. Have you read my article?
Assad's soldiers turned their guns on crowds.
No, that literally never happened. Read my article. I wrote an article called "Clearing the Confusion: How the Syrian War Started."
Did it not start when those 2 to 3 teenagers
the boys were arrested for graffiti, and then
were arrested for graffitiing, and then they were brutally tortured and murdered?
I wrote about that in my article. Like, I acknowledge that happened. But the thing is, when I went to Syria, a lot of Syrians simply haven't heard of it. Now, of course, your response would be that's because they're propagandized by the government. But it's not that simple. I mean, there are other cases of government abuse that Syrians know about, but they don't know about that particular case. And after those boys were released, because even
you talk about what areas? What areas did you talk?
I'm not going to Idlib, my friend. I'm not going to go visit.
Yeah, I know. You're not going to Idlib, but like. But if you're the regime supporters in Damascus...
Yeah, I mean, Damascus is the capital city. I mean, if you want to overthrow a country, being able to seize power in the capital city kind of matters. And in Damascus, they're not popular. In Aleppo, they're even less popular.
Well, that's because, like, the rebels were deported from those areas.
Because the what, sorry? The rebels...
There was obviously...
Did you say they were
There was obviously...
in? So they were...
No. There was internal dissent in Damascus and Aleppo. And when
the internal does not explain the external. That's the problem, right? Like in the first week, the internal does not explain the magnitude of the external. That's my argument.
Okay,
so
explain that.
Okay, sure. So, in the first week of protests, right? Sorry, in the first month of protests, let's say, about...
Yeah.
No, sorry, the first week of protests, exactly. There was an article written by Suleiman Khalidi, and he wrote this in March 2011. And he mentioned a casualty figure, and he said there's been protests, 37 civilians have been killed. Now, that news report then went all over the world for entirely honest and understandable reasons, and they said, 37 protesters have been killed, right? Because the government has fired on them. That was the conclusion that they were drawing from the fact that there had been battles raging in Dara, in the southern part of Syria, right? But then when we look back at it, when more investigative work was done about who those 37 casualties were, 24 of them were Syrian government soldiers. Now, I'm not saying that Syrian security forces have literally never killed civilians. That's absurd to say in the context of a war, right? Because in any war, right? I mean, civilians do unfortunately die, right? But there is a major difference, which is that when, for example, the Syrian government lays siege to a town, they're the ones that are trying to get the civilian population out, and it's the so-called rebels that are under that siege that have systematically over and over again prevented the civilians from leaving.
That is true of the late phase of the war.
That's the late phase. Okay, if you want to talk about the early phase of the war, back in 2011, in July, there were protests in Marat al-Numan in Idlib, right? So the same area that's currently occupied by Turkey, right? And they were previously occupied by Turkey. It's been liberated, actually, within the past month or so. So they talk about how there were protests against the government that were okayed by the security forces until infiltrators within the protests entered these peaceful protests and then started shooting at the government and then retreated, and then the government forces panicked. They responded by murdering civilians, right? Because they were shot at first, and this was covered by Hala Jabr. Now, I've looked at the reporting. Like, you got to remember, I've been following this war since 2011, right? So I've been following all of the reporting.
I've been following since 2011.
But the thing is, once you've heard this saying, right? Like, when something about the truth putting on its shoes after the lies have spread around the world, right? So then, I mean, obviously Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, the Gulf channels that had an interest in overthrowing the Syrian government, they took the 37 protesters killed thing and ran with it, right? And then they made that the tagline of literally every single article and newspaper, etc., right? And in fact, people from Al Jazeera, I forget, there was one recently, right, have actually resigned because of the blatant twisting of facts in order to skew the perception of Syria.
So in your narrative, Al Jazeera like creates this artificial sense that the people are opposed to the regime and the regime is like cracking down on people,
That
etc.
the people are disproportionately. Well, here's the thing. There's two oppositions to the Syrian government, right? There's the people that wanted democratic reforms, and there's the people that
Yes.
wanted to violently overthrow the state. Okay.
Yes.
Now, when we talk about the people that wanted democratic reforms, can you tell me what those reforms were?
Look, I know what you're going to say. You're going to talk about the constitutional changes that were brought in by the Assad government, where he changed like the official status of the Ba'ath Party, etc., in the constitution.
Yeah, I know that
Is
stuff
that
matters. That's what people wanted, right? But here's the contradiction, right? Often in these countries, the people that are against corruption don't particularly care about democracy, right? They'd much rather corruption be dealt with, which in many instances requires a degree of authoritarianism, right? Whereas the people that want democracy, they're not particularly concerned about corruption, right? So you have contradictions, right, that result in
yeah?
difficulties in a broad national movement of forming to begin with. So there was even the
Yeah.
movement, even the people that wanted democracy, right? They were sure on, or they wanted all kinds of different things. What they agreed on was that the hegemony of the Ba'ath Party has to end, and they have to move towards a multi-party democratic framework.
Has that ended though? The hegemony of the Ba'ath Party, has that ended?
Well, hegemony can persist after the legal basis of that hegemony has ended.
But arguably, yeah. But it persists
You
because there are
can't,
extra
you can't, you
measures.
can't, as a political demand, you can't say we demand the end of the Ba'ath Party's hegemony. What you can say is we demand that the constitutional pillars that are upholding that hegemony be replaced with more politically neutral ones so that we can have a multi-party democracy. But you can't say
But
we
is
demand
Syria?
that the hegemony end.
Would you describe Syria as a multi-party democracy now?
Yes, I would. Syria actually has more political
Because
parties than Australia does. More
but
representation.
all of them are fundamentally part of the status quo, correct?
What does that mean? I mean, are you talking about constitutional,
Like
legal
because like
questions or?
the opposition has either been hounded into exile or herded into Idlib, where they live under like the tyranny
Whoa,
and
okay,
the
okay.
rule of al.
I mean, when you say opposition, remember I said before there's two oppositions, right? We're just talking
Yeah, I agree.
about the ones that want reforms, right? We're not talking about the ones that wanted to violently overthrow the state. The ones that wanted reforms did not want to violently overthrow the state. This is very important, right? And in a
No
country
one
like
wants.
Syria, if you want to overthrow the state, and if the government is genuinely unpopular, and given the fact that countries like Syria have conscript armies, mass conscript armies, these armies are generally not good at putting down popular rebellions. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like there is a
Yeah.
massive a body of armed men who do not want to be there, and if they don't like the government, and if the government asks them to protect them at all costs, despite their economic policies and their injustices, then they will quite simply defect to the side of the protesters, which is what happened in
Well,
Egypt to
that's
a certain degree.
to a certain degree it was happening in Syria in that like the armed forces
No,
under
the
Assad
army did
were
not break. The
no, it
number
did
of
not defect.
defectors was so small. It
No,
was tiny.
no, I'm not talking about defections. I'm not talking about defections, Jay, but I'm talking about they had a huge manpower shortage by 2015. That is definitely the case. By 2015, the Assad regime was on its knees before
Yeah,
Russia into.
that's because the country's been bled, right? So usually the reason why it has a
They,
manpower
they,
shortage is because you
like,
people. I mean, you guys keep bringing up the fact that the. I've heard it said, not just you, right? So maybe I shouldn't project this onto you, but I wouldn't be surprised if you agreed with this characterization that Assad has killed 500,000 people, but nobody ever looks at the composition of that figure.
well,
100,000 of them are
obviously,
Syrian
all the
government
head up.
soldiers. Sorry.
Oh, I obviously agree that not all the people who were killed in Syria were killed at the result as a result of like Assad.
I'm talking about that.
Obviously,
Look,
is a factor.
look. My point is this, right? That the defections from the Syrian army were very small, right? From the actual Syrian army.
Just gonna I'm gonna let my dog into my room. Come on, Max. Okay, all good. Sorry. Yes.
No, but the defections from the Syrian army were quite small. But my point is this, right? I mean, we have no control over how the Syrian government conducts itself internally. We have very little control over that. What we have control over is the driving force of the war, which is the attempt to overthrow the state, which is the extent to which we are actively arming and supporting the non-state actors that are waging war against the Syrian government. Now, is that something that we is that something that
the US and the West haven't supported? The US and the West haven't supported armed opposition outside of the SPD and the Kurds since like 2015.
SPD?
Sorry, the Kurds. You mean
the SDF?
Yes, SDF. Sorry,
okay.
I had a brain fart.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look, you're wrong. You're completely wrong there. So did you say
since 2015?
Since 2015. Okay, fine, whatever. Right. So before 2015.
I agree. I agree. Early on in the war, the West was arming the Free Syrian Army, whatever that was.
So would you agree with my priority list there, right? So I've got, let's say that, like, because we were talking before about human rights and what your priorities are, right? Would you agree that my priority list makes logical sense, right? I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, I'm an Australian. I'm not a global citizen. I'm an Australian, right? Which means that to the extent that I'm responsible for anything that happens outside the borders of Australia, it's to the extent that it's negative, which means that, like, I should take moral responsibility for it. And it's something that we're actually affecting in some way. Now, okay, Australia's direct involvement doesn't mean much, but we're an English-speaking country, which means that our voice can be heard and listened to within the Anglo Empire in general. Australia, the UK, New Zealand, Canada, right? And of course the United States, which is the main one, right? Which is the main armor and funder of the forces waging war against the Syrian state. So given that we are responsible for so much of the external destabilization, that essentially became my priority, to the point where talking about whatever the Syrian government has been accused of is completely deprioritized because it was being weaponized for the purpose of overthrowing the state, which is the driving force behind the war to begin with.
But my position is pretty simple, and I think it's logically consistent. You can condemn the Assad regime's human rights abuses while recognizing that any attempt at this point in 2019 to overthrow the Assad regime would just end up in like burning slave pit hellhole.
Here's a problem, right? I mean, you end up manufacturing consent for way too many things, right? I mean,
not necessarily because, like,
no,
for example,
you do. It's actually very. Here's the thing, right? Like, the minute you start criticizing the Syrian government, it demobilizes people from wanting to stand up to imperialism. When the overwhelming focus of the Western media and the Western left, unfortunately, over the course of this entire conflict, has been to demonize the Syrian government. That has been their overwhelming focus. It's only from 2015, 2016 onwards that a few people started to wake up, and we started hearing the kind of perspectives that Hands Off Syria, the organization that I'm with, has been saying since the beginning.
You can say that Assad is a horrible dictator who is responsible.
Why say it? What's the point? Who are you trying to please when you say it?
Well, I'm trying. I'm interested in the truth.
What's your purpose?
Well, my purpose is getting towards the truth, and if the truth
is the truth, right? So we have different objectives because you're just trying to figure out what's objectively true. I'm trying to stop something, right? I'm trying to stop something catastrophic.
Okay, so under that paradigm, you would be happy lying to defend the Assad regime to stop that catastrophic.
No, I'm just not going to focus on it, right? I mean, first of all, a lot of we have outright denied a lot of the accusations leveled at the Syrian government because we believe that the evidence backs us up on that, right? But the question about why we don't do what you do and just like criticize everyone blindly and equally, right? Is because it is the equivalent of playing God, right? It is the equivalent of playing God. You are looking at the world and you're saying, my job is to judge everything in proportion to the crimes, to the decimal point, right? And then the more accurate I am about the world, there's going to be some reward for me, right? in some, you know,
Rewards, Jay. It's not
what is
about
it? What
rewards.
is the purpose, right? Because you said before that your purpose is simply to understand the truth, but that's not my purpose. So we have a different.
The purpose is the purpose is to, as far as possible, get to the truth of the matter. And if the truth of the matter is that Assad's a brutal.
Why? Why is that your purpose? I mean, it serves no good purpose. That's what I'm saying.
Sorry about the dog.
No, that's all right. That's all right.
Like, I've got a counterpoint to you.
Sure.
Hang on, I'm gonna start this thing. Okay. My counterpoint to you. You condemn the Israeli government, correct?
Yeah, I do, because
Yeah.
again, for the same reason, it's because Israel is on our side geopolitically.
Okay, but say it wasn't on our side geopolitically, you'd still condemn Israel,
I probably
correct?
would not condemn Israel to the same extent if Australia was.
Okay, say
I mean,
say you were living.
let's to give it
Say you were back in
to
Venezuela.
give it a proper comparison with Syria, you'd have to assume that Israel is Australia is actively hostile towards Israel. Now, if Australia was actively hostile towards Israel, I would personally consider it to be a waste of my time to spend about as much time as I spent on Syria on opposing Israel. Yes, I mean, but that hypothetical doesn't exist because in the world that we live in currently, Australia is more than friends with Israel, and therefore talking about the crimes of Israel is going to be a priority for me.
Say you were back in Kerala, would you condemn Israel and still support BDS, etc.? Boycott, divestment, sanctions?
Well, the Indian government is pro-Israel, so the comparison doesn't seem to make sense. The comparison will only make sense if.
Okay, let's just say for the sake of the argument, you decide to move to Syria. You're over there, and obviously the Syrian government's hostile to Israel.
Yeah.
They're in a state of war technically still. Would you still support BDS and oppose Israel?
Of course I would.
Because intrinsically,
of course I would. But
yeah.
But the thing is, look, here's the thing: we have to have priorities about what we talk about, right?
Yes, we do have priorities, but my point is, if you would be committed to opposing Israel's human rights abuses wherever you were in the world, then why would you not be committed to opposing human rights abuses carried out by someone else?
Like Assad.
Regardless of
back to
geopolitical paradigm.
Back to question one. What is the driving force of the war in Syria? Right? It is the attempt to overthrow the state. Even if you think the attempt to overthrow the state is good, it's subjectively correct. It's like, Jay, for example, the Cuban Revolution, right? I mean, it was
yes.
the overthrow of the state, but it was a good thing in my opinion, right? So
yeah, but you could conceivably, Jay.
Yeah.
You could conceivably oppose the overthrow of Assad, and then still recognize that he's done some terrible things, and there's nothing really morally good about it.
What has he done? What has he done that's so terrible?
Don't you want to be consistent? Don't you want to be getting towards the truth of the matter? Don't you want to?
The Syrian government has responded. The Syrian government has responded to attempts to overthrow it. The way that any
let's say, look, you know my position on the chemical attacks, etc. I believe they occurred and they were carried out by the Assad regime. I know you don't believe that they were carried out by the Assad regime. Okay, let's say, though, for the sake of the argument, it were true that Assad carried out those chemical attacks. Would you then still just be like, because the overarching narrative of the war is outside?
I would, because we are.
So you'd still
because I'm not a global citizen. I'm an Australian citizen. We are responsible for things to the extent that we're actually carrying them out.
For the lives that are. You wouldn't feel responsible for the lives that.
No, because I'm not Syrian. I'm Australian, right? I mean, this is a very, very important point for me.
But do you care about Syrian lives?
Look, I think we've been over this. I think it's pretty obvious. You care about the truth. You care about judging things and whatnot in proportion to the level of suffering. Judgment. No,
it's about
we have different. I'm consistent. I think we're both consistent. I think we're both consistent to a certain extent. I just think that you're actually more consistency to something else, which I'd like to talk about, right?
Okay. We can move on from Syria.
Here's the thing. I've noticed this among a lot of progressives, right? Which is that they might be good on a whole lot of issues, right? So take for example You have class issues, gender and sexuality issues, and overseas issues, right? Like, for example, being against war, right? Now,
Yeah.
what happened over the past 20 years is that because the corporate media decides what gets airtime and whose voices get heard and who gets hired and things like that, you might have someone who's excellent on those three things, right? They've got progressive views on all of them, right? But
Yep.
then only their views on gender and sexuality would get aired, right? I mean, over the past 10,
Yeah.
12 years or something like that.
I
It's like we don't
understand
want
what
to
you mean.
hear about your anti-imperialism and your, like, you know, your stuff about workers, right? We just care about this particular thing. And then because that's what pays the bills, right? They end up making that like the core part of their life. Now, I've noticed this
Yeah.
with you, Drew, which is that you've made attacking the Chinese government a core part of your life, right? And I understand where you're coming from, but I'm just saying, I mean, in the sense that, yes, objectively, what China is doing, right? I mean, in Hong Kong, not so much, but like in Xinjiang, right? Where, yes, I mean, they are detaining large numbers of people. I don't agree with the figure of 1 million. I think that's been plucked out of thin air.
It's actually
No,
they
no, but let me
estimate
finish.
up
I'll
to
let you. I'll let you
yeah.
address that particular thing, right?
Yeah.
But it's certainly not liberal. I mean, what they're doing is they're saying this large male population from this ethnic group, they have strong Islamist, pan-Turkic ideological leanings, and therefore we are going to screen them on a very, very large scale to the point where they are de-radicalized, right? I mean, that's not liberal at all, right? It is like, it's a violation of every single liberal individualist, whatever, right? I get that.
But Jay, it's not even about liberalism and
But this is
illiberalism.
I wanted
I'm
to, I
just
wanted
opposed
to,
to fucking torture camps.
no, no, no. Listen. I get
Yeah.
what you're saying, right? I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
But my point is, the thing that I was going to say before is that what happens is that if you say, for example, you have these views on China, right? And you've made
Yeah.
that the the majority of what you talk about. Right?
Yeah.
It seems like opposition to Chinese government influence. But then I'm sure that you're also against the war against Yemen.
Yes, I
Yeah,
am.
I
I
mean, you're
am.
against the
I've talked
sale of
about it.
weapons to Saudi Arabia. I'm sure you have, right? I'm sure you have. But
Yeah.
what do you get in the media for, right? I mean, most of
Yeah.
the coverage that you get is over China. And that's because there's a geopolitical agenda on the part of our government to contain China, right? And so you
I
end up, even though your reasons are completely honest, right? You end
yeah.
up in a sense, signaling for them, right? Manufacturing consent for what is fundamentally their agenda, right? Now, if you want that to be your agenda, then that's fine. But that makes you someone who is basically an Australian imperialist who's just cynical about it and using
I'm not.
humanitarian motives.
See, that's the thing, Jay. I'm not. A lot of people have leveled that accusation at me that have just used this cynically to get in the media, and it's not the case because this is something I'm genuinely passionate about. I've got Uyghur friends who have talked to me in intimate detail about how they were tortured back home. They've talked to me about how they haven't seen their families in years. I've seen screenshots from my Uyghur friends who were rung in the middle of the night, FaceTime, and there were two security agents there, and they had his mother, and they said, "Don't go to any more protests in Brisbane, or we're taking your mother." And I saw screenshots of that video call that he had. He was called in the middle of the night.
Look,
So
I look.
I'm
My
genuinely
point
outraged.
is, I understand, right? And when you know what, like, I think we can connect on this. When you meet someone from a country, or a nation, in your case, that you believe um, you believe that their story isn't being told, right? You believe that
Yeah.
that they need like somebody to speak for them. Then yeah, I mean, it hits you right there, right? And you want to really champion
Yeah.
their cause. I get that.
That is it was there was like there was a moment I still
I'm saying
remember,
that this
and
is a problem that you and I both face, Drew. I'm not trying to make this
yeah.
about you. I mean,
Yes.
like it is about you. I mean, you're a public figure now. But what I'm saying is that if when you have like a number of things that you're good on, right, and a few of them happen to align with the interests of the United States or Australia, then that's what's going to get like the majority of the attention. So that's
Look,
why
this is the thing,
that
though.
also
Can I
I
say
think
one
that
thing?
also explains like my priorities. That's why I don't, for example,
Yeah.
spend all my time attacking the Chinese government. Because I think it's counterproductive, and that actually fits
See,
into my broader. Yeah,
can I say something though?
sure.
Like to me,
the reason why I'm so passionate about this issue is because I don't believe it is in the interest of the United States or Australia, the elite classes of these countries, to crack down on trade, say for example, with China because of these
Oh,
humanitarian. I,
that's a good point.
I I don't support. I don't. Let me outline my position. So at this point, I'm not someone who's fucking a psycho who wants to like overthrow. I don't want war. Obviously, it would be a nuclear holocaust and it'd be hell. I don't want war, but I support an equivalent of boycott, divestment, sanctions for China as we speak because I don't believe it is ethical for us to be, just as people argue it's not ethical to be, I guess, doing business with Israel as those human rights abuses are being perpetrated. I don't think it's ethical for Australia's billionaire elite class to be making money selling ore to China while these terrible human rights abuses are being perpetrated. So my whole thing, the reason I'm so passionate about this is because the Australian elite doesn't fucking want to destroy our current relationship with China economically. The Australian elite loves making money from China.
Look,
I've
you
received
got a very good point there.
See, like, a lot of people have said, oh, like the media is completely on Drew's side or whatever, and like he's like furthering the elite interests of the elite, and that's why he gets airtime. But in a lot of ways,
No,
I
but you're
don't
right.
further.
The Australian ruling class is split on the China question.
Yeah, but I am fucking pissing off. Like, which person, like, as if fucking like say Gina Reinhardt or Clive Palmer wants to say end exports to China tomorrow over what's happening in Xinjiang. They don't give a fuck about
No,
Uyghur
of
Muslims.
course not. Of course not. It just
Yeah.
doesn't work that way.
So to me, I don't believe that I'm this establishment pro status quo type. Ultimately, I'm still a libertarian socialist at the end of the day. I'm not about nationalism. I'm not about furthering the Australian nation.
I think it's extremely selfless to advocate imposing sanctions on a country that would cripple the Australian economy overnight.
Yeah, I reckon
I think it's selfless, man. Like, I don't know.
that's honestly like Jay. What I am advocating for, boycott, divestment, sanctions on China, it would fucking destroy the Australian economy. It would hurt us so much. But what I'm arguing is that it is so immoral to make money trading with China while this genocide is happening.
And I think this is part of the plan. I think, like for example, in the US they say that the new political divide is between the globalists and the nationalists. Now, this used to be like something that only the alt-right used to talk about, but nowadays you can find documentaries done by PBS where they talk about this exact same dichotomy. I mean, it's being popularized in the American like mainstream press these days. Anyway, the corporate press, nationalists versus globalists, like Steve Bannon, who helped get Trump elected. He's a nationalist, and I forget the other guy, but. Basically, this is like this is the contradiction. The globalists are pro-China, right? In the sense that,
They are.
yeah. The nationalists are anti-China, but I think that part of the reason they're anti-China is because talking about how evil China is allows them to start imposing tariffs on Chinese goods. So
I agree.
In order to help them reindustrialize, right? But
The problem I would actually
go on.
The problem I would actually agree with you is that like the people that are opposing it on nationalist lines, like they're opposing it for fucking the dumbest reasons ever. I don't give a fuck about tariffs or rebuilding industrial bases or whatever. I really don't care about economics at all. I literally don't have an economic theory. Like, Joker, like burn it all. That's literally my economic theory. Like, I'm not.
No, actually,
I don't care.
The Joker had an economic theory. Actually, it was a very interesting one.
Well, he's like burn my half or whatever.
No, it's not that. What you'll notice about the Joker is that he initially wanted to clean up the city, and he thought that like the mafia had too much control over politics, and so he ends up bankrupting the mafia, right?
Yeah.
So he had an economic theory, and it kind of worked, right? So it's not like he just wanted to burn everything or watch the world burn.
There are economic nationalists though who oppose China because they want to rebuild the economic industrial bases of their country. There are also nationalists who are just legitimately anti-China because they're just legitimate xenophobes. They're just racist. Like this, that's what I would argue Steve Bannon is. He's like when I went to America, I talked to some China.
Right? You're a solipsist.
Yeah.
You're a solipsist.
Solipsist. What do you mean?
you fundamentally care about, like, you put yourself at the center of everything, right? And you say, well, I hold these things because it's what I believe, right? Whereas I see myself as being this irrelevant speck, right? Trying to influence the direction of forces and interests that are already in motion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I agree there are forces and interests already in motion. It's not just about me, and obviously I'm never going to be able to do enough. My thinking is just I would like to fucking advocate for what I believe in until the day I die, and if I make even a fucking speck of an impact, then that's
So
enough.
why do you think the Chinese are doing this in Xinjiang? What do you think they're
Well, I think so. There are two reasons I think. Like, partly there's like a Han chauvinism, like a Han ethno state. Like, there's a conservative idea that like the Chinese nation is just Han people, and like the pesky minorities or whatever have to be subsumed under like the broader nation, or otherwise like they'll ultimately bring it down. So there's an ethno-nationalist component to it where like they are trying to assert Han supremacy over minority groups in China, and then there's also the economic component where like the province of Xinjiang, which literally means new territories. So it was originally conquered by the Qing dynasty, by the Manchus, and then incorporated into the Chinese dynasty then. And it literally means new territories. Like it was established as like
the
a settled.
Manchus who were helping the Uyghurs fight off the Jungas.
Yes, that is true. That is true.
So they intervened on the side of the Uyghurs to fight the Jungas. Okay.
Yeah, that is true. But
so you see,
it was
the
actually
reason why I bring that up is because the power relations between different nations are important when judging a state to be an ethno-state, because ethno-state is a word that's come up recently because the alt-right have been calling for it and Israel has been accused of it. So it carries that baggage, which you might want to just impose on China, but it's something that I wouldn't do, not just because, you'd say, it's because Jay loves China or something, but also because the power relations within China between the different ethnic groups have been significantly more even over time. So, for example, have the Han Chinese been conquered?
Yes.
Have the Han Chinese been conquered by hinterland Eurasian tribes and populations, by Turks,
although
by Mongols, by Manchus? Have they?
No, but
yes,
their conquerors were always subsumed under the Han. Their conquerors were always subsumed under Han culture.
Yeah, I know, because Han culture was the dominant culture. Even when the Mongols took over China, they ended up adopting the culture of the people they had conquered, right? The Central Asian populations, right, have generally done that, right? The Turks took over Anatolia, they adopted Greek, Armenian, Persian culture.
Arguably, the Han have never been conquered because they ultimately, like...
They're isolated.
They basically...
Yeah.
Sorry?
No, I'm not saying so. I'm just saying that the power relations between the Han Chinese and the Chinese state and its various minorities is significantly different from that of other nations. So the US, for example, if you say... If whites in the US say that the United States should be an ethno-state for whites only, then it's excluding the black population, first of all, whose significant contribution in the form of forced labor, slavery, helped to build the United States. So that's like an ethno-nationalism which actively excludes those who have a legitimate stake economically based on their contribution. Whereas you can't. That doesn't translate well over to other countries.
But is that really what we're? Is that the only thing that we're interested in? Like someone having a basis or a claim to like being part of like the broader nation based on the economic contribution?
Let me tell you why, right? Which brings me to my second point. The reason why the Chinese are doing what they're doing in Xinjiang is because they believe that there is a plan, a pan-Turkic but also Islamic plot to sever East Turkestan from China, so that it then joins with this Turkish bloc, which is then able to control all of the trade from China to.
I understand that's what's motivating part of their actions.
Do you support this as a goal? Pan-Turkic expansionism.
Pan-Turkic expansionism? Yeah. No, although I would support the Uyghur people and the other minorities in the region being able to exercise autonomy in their own self-government and having the option for independence in a referendum.
The option of independence. Okay, so look, just be open about it.
Ultimately,
right?
there should be the option. No, ultimately, all groups should have the option for self-government,
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's a basic, universal thing.
self-determination.
Yeah, it's a principle. I get that. But the thing is that all of these principles of yours, I mean, there's agendas behind them, right? I mean, the agenda is, so there is like a geopolitical agenda here, right? China wants to keep that area under its control, whereas Turkey wants to break it off, right?
Why does why does China want to keep that area under its control?
Because it's a transit route.
Yes, so there are economic benefits, but
Yeah, they're not getting resources from it. They're basically just putting a lot of road and infrastructure through
it's
through
the center of
Xinjiang.
the New Belt and Road project.
Yeah, exactly. And Xinjiang is going to benefit
So,
greatly from it.
so you accept that they are basically overriding the wishes for self-autonomy, for self-determination and autonomy of the local minorities solely for economic benefits?
I don't know. I haven't seen a poll of the population of Xinjiang to see what percentage supports the government and what doesn't. Presumably, a lot of people end up in those camps because they get told on by their friends and relatives.
A lot of people end up in those camps for no reason at all.
Oh,
Like,
I mean,
I
like,
recently saw a report. I recently saw a report, Jay.
Why would
Like
a state just
hundreds of
imprison people
disabled
for no
people.
reason? It doesn't happen.
What?
Nothing ever happens for no reason. You can think the reasons
No,
are
but
unjust, but
no,
it's
no.
not no reason.
What happened? Did you read the recent document dump? Someone within the CCP leaked the Xinjiang papers to the New York Times.
Tell me.
And as part of that document dump, we saw that Xi Jinping, he initiated the entire crackdown by calling in 2014 or something like that in a secret speech to the party, calling on the party to eradicate the virus and Uyghur thinking, using all the organs of dictatorship, showing no mercy.
Mm-hmm.
So that was his call in 2014, and then he placed in charge of Xinjiang province an official who was previously the head of Tibet and who had pioneered like repressive policies in Tibet designed to like keep the Tibetan population from being restive, etc. So he pioneered the destruction of temples. He pioneered the use of an intense security apparatus regime to like watch over Tibetans, etc. This man who was in charge of the crackdown on Tibet was then placed in charge of Xinjiang, and he then put out an order to all lower level officials, saying round up all who should be rounded up. So obviously an extremely broad thing.
Look,
and then
the context.
you
know that there are 20,000 Uyghurs fighting in Syria, right?
Yeah, I agree, but can I go on
sorry.
for a little bit? So obviously a very broad command, and then you look at incentives within the bureaucracy, and people always want to impress the higher ups, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so lower level officials had the incentive to round up as many people as possible, regardless of whether they actually did display like signs of like adhering to a radical Islamist ideology. They were just basically incentivized to round up as many as they could to impress higher ups.
Oh yeah, that definitely.
Yeah, and the higher ups in turn had like quotas that they had to meet to impress Xi Jinping.
Yeah, okay.
And
look, I think the reason why this conversation started is because I said that it couldn't have been for no reason. Now we're thinking about reason differently, right? I'm thinking about reason from the top, right? What is the top level Chinese reason for this overall program? Whereas I think when you were saying no reason, you were talking about individuals, right? That you knew individuals or had heard of individuals who had no...
Yes,
literally,
well, like on an individual level...
They got caught in the dragnet. They were unlucky.
Yeah, but can we just dismiss like what is like essentially like
anything.
terrible...
I'm just...
You can't just say it's unlucky.
It's not a priority in my life, right? That's my point.
Why though?
My priority.
Why,
okay, well, why wouldn't Yemen be your priority, right? In Yemen, 10 million.
It is a priority.
It's not a priority to the same extent that China is for you. I think you'd agree with that.
I agree with that because, for me, probably just my personal relationship with like many Uyghur friends is what made me.
So it's not really about adhering to a universal principle. It's because of your personal
I do care about universal principles. I also oppose the current terrible regime, the terrible war that's going on in Yemen, being prosecuted by the Saudis with the help of the American government. I've called multiple times to sanction the Saudi leadership and to completely sever our ties with
them, right? Let's compare them. In terms of mortality rate, how does Yemen and Xinjiang compare in terms of mortality rate? The number of people being killed. The scale for Yemen, what's happening in Yemen, when the war in Yemen finishes, right? Mark my words, and they do a census, it will be revealed that at least 5 to 6 million people perished because of the famine.
I agree with you, Jay. I agree. It's a genocidal campaign, and the US
not
and
just
Australia.
That, we are directly involved in this genocide that's being perpetrated against the Yemeni people. Directly involved. Okay,
I've called multiple times for Australia not to be involved anymore with Saudi.
You know what happens, right? Yes, you talk. I know your position on Yemen is good, right? And I commend you for that, right? But what happens is that your voice on China gets magnified 1,000 times, right? Whereas your voice on Yemen will be completely ignored, right?
It's frustrating for me too.
Yeah.
I agree because
it's just something to think about. It's just something to think about in future. I mean, I think it makes perfect sense, right? I think it would be a far more honest way of putting it that you said, look, I'm going to talk about the issues that get me attention. That way, I can.
It's not about attention, because if it was just solely about attention, I also wouldn't post about, say, like the Australian government having like refugee torture camps in Manus and Nauru, which would destroy my support among a lot of people who think, oh, Drew's the anti-China guy. Like,
you know what this means? It means that you got to get your own platform, Drew. You got to get your own platform so that you can set your own priorities instead of the corporate media determining.
Well, that's why I have a Twitter account, and that's why I have a Twitter account, and I post from there.
I'm not having a go at you. All people who get involved in public life have this dilemma, have this problem that confronts them, which is that their priorities are not reflected in the coverage of what they talk about.
I agree, and it's frustrating to me when no one gives a shit about me criticizing like the refugee torture camps on Nauru and Manus, but people care when I criticize the Chinese state. I agree, it's a shit thing. It's frustrating to me personally because for me, I never intended to be solely a critic of the Chinese regime. My intention has always been to be more broadly a critic of human rights abuses, and that's what I still intend to do more broadly throughout the entire course of my life. So obviously the current activism that I am doing is a small sliver of what my total activism output will be once I am like 80 or 90 or whatever. I care a lot about China, and I care a lot about the human rights abuses that are going on. For me, mostly because I look upon like our elderly generation, like the generation that came before us that failed in Rwanda. They didn't care because Rwanda was not important to the Western global regime or whatever. They didn't care because these were just poor black people, and they just allowed like 1 million people to be slaughtered. And to me, the failure to intervene and stop the Rwandan genocide is like one of the great moral catastrophes of the 20th century. And my perspective is simply, I never want another Rwanda to occur. When another genocide faces us, we have to oppose it. I believe what's happening in Xinjiang right now is a genocide, which is why I talk about it a lot, and which is why I post about it a lot. I also agree with you that what is happening in Yemen has genocidal characteristics. The Saudis are arguably waging a genocidal campaign against Yemen, and I agree with you that Australia should not be involved in it at all. We should basically fucking completely diplomatically and economically isolate Saudi Arabia and destroy our relationship with Saudi Arabia. I don't want a single person in the Australian government. I don't want a single Australian business to do business with Saudi Arabia. I'm not simply a China critic, Jay. I intend to eventually.
Makes you into one. I think that's fair, right?
I know the media does that, but my intention is to go beyond that in my life, because I'm not just going to like spend my career as a China critic or whatever. I would like to eventually go into politics or whatever, or journalism, and write more broadly about human rights abuses, because I agree with you that China is not the only human rights catastrophe that's going on today. Yemen is a terrible catastrophe. And I agree that we have a lot of moral complicity in that.
A lot more than what's happening in China. I mean, in China, you know, like in the case of Yemen, like it's something that we can very easily stop. Right, by saying, look, we're not going to sell weapons anymore, right? Or something like that. I would say though that
we do have a moral complicity. We do have a lot of responsibility for what's happening.
Sorry, I think you're cutting out. Say that again.
Yeah, something's going on in the background. What's that?
Maybe it's my
Oh,
maybe
it's
that
okay.
was my aircon. Okay, can you hear me better
Yeah,
now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I mean, I
But I would disagree that we have no influence over China because we do have so much influence over China. Like the Chinese elite
it's
love. The Chinese elite parks its money in Australia. The Chinese elite political leadership parks its family park their families in Australia because it's a safe Western liberal
yeah,
democracy
yeah, it's
close
true.
by China. That they park their assets there and they park their families here because it's a safe haven in the case that they get purged back home or whatever.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of responsibility because we actually are very intimately tied with the Chinese government in many ways.
Yeah, and like when it comes to the elite elites within the CCP,
Yeah,
like I mean, obviously, I side with the working class, right, within the CCP.
because imagine the equivalent situation, Jay. Like the Saudi leadership stashed all their oil money in Australia, and the Saudi leadership had all their families studying at Australian universities and had them all with Australian citizenship just in case there was intrigue at the royal court and they get purged back home. Imagine that's the equivalent. Arguably, that's what's happening in Australia with regard to the CCP because the CCP elite
Yeah, I mean,
use Australia.
I don't spend my time imagining alternate scenarios. I mean, I do it like if it's to prove a point about the importance of a historic event that's already happened. But on this, my theory, and I've been thinking about this for a while, is that the United States actually needs Australia to be a primary commodity exporter in order for the Chinese to maintain their faith in the US dollar. Because the Chinese basically see Australia as a satellite of the United States, which is fair enough.
That's true.
Yeah. And so the Chinese would basically look at it this way. They'd say, look, the reason why, or the extent to which we maintain faith in the US dollar is because the satellites of the United States, most importantly Australia, are willing to sell their primary commodities to us, which we need for our industry, right? And so,
I don't even think that's the reason why though.
why? What do you mean?
Like in my experience, the US is actually like fucking so pissed that Australia's like largest export partner is now China.
No, no. Look, this is the contradiction between globalism and nationalism within the United States. So the nationalists, I mean the globalists, I mean they're pro China. They want to keep this arrangement going, right? Because this
Yeah.
arrangement is one which basically says the Chinese will accept our dollars. This is the United States, and the
Well, it prints
Australians
money for the
will
Western elite.
yeah, and the Australians will ensure that our dollars are good for something because they sell their iron ore to the Chinese, right? So it makes sense that the globalists would want to maintain that kind of arrangement, right? Whereas the nationalists, they worry about the deindustrialization of Western countries like Australia and the United States. So they would look at it by saying, like, yeah, we hate China as well, but we hate China because they're destroying us, destroying our economy, they're taking our jobs, that kind of thing, right? So
Yeah.
the globalists, like people who support Trump, they see China as mainly an economic threat, right? Whereas the nationalists see China mainly as an economic threat. That's what I said, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas the globalists, they're the ones that use all of the humanitarian logic to try and contain China because, on the one hand, they're economically committed to the system of US dollar hegemony, which is like what they're trying to maintain. But that system is unraveling because of the Belt and Road Initiative and the overall process of Eurasian integration that's been happening. And so, another
Yeah.
front in that war of preventing Eurasian integration from happening is to break off Xinjiang from China. And so that's my worldview. That's how I look at it, right? So I want, for example, Australia. You and I want some very similar things, right? And this is, I think,
Yeah.
it's important to focus on similarities, right? Rather than just arguing gets nowhere. I want to see Australia re-industrialize, right, for the 21st century, right? That's
Like in what sense? Like describe to me what that might look like.
Oh, I mean, thorium, nuclear energy, just environmental schemes that does it all sustainably. Just like make Australia awesome, right? Like with
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
like
Sure.
with the best technology, but also reparations for for the indigenous population so that we can settle the national question once and for all. Like, I mean, I have great hopes for this country, right? But Australia refuses, right, to have a pro-industrial policy because we're so committed to this overall system of US hegemony, because we're such good partners with the US that we're willing to kind of sync with them, right? And that's what I feel, that we are more likely to just, because of the English language and the historical bonds, that we're just going to keep syncing with the United States, rather than saying, you know what, you deal with your own thing, we're going to put off tariffs, we're going to industrialize, we're going to have like an industrial economy. And you're going to have to work out your differences with the Chinese, right? We can't keep supporting your dollar this way. But we're never going to do it, because no politician in this country has the courage to think about Australia as an independent player globally.
Well, I agree with you that basically no politician has the courage to see Australia as like an independent actor with its own independent foreign policy, which is part of my problem with our current relationship with China. Arguably, with both superpowers, like, the political class just acts as though we're powerless, and we're the economic vassal of China, and then the political vassal of the United States. And I disagree. I think I disagree with that conception of Australia. Obviously, I don't want Australia to be a vassal country to anyone.
So do you think it is, or you don't want it to be? They're two different questions.
No, I think it probably is as we speak. Like, Australia is China's economic vassal and America's political vassal. And I think that's the case as we speak, and I don't want that for Australia. But at the same time, it's difficult because to some extent we do need I think we do need to some extent the US alliance, because we need a nuclear umbrella.
Okay, so now you're talking realpolitik. I mean, all of your universal values have gone out the window, because surely you'd be appalled by all the human rights abuses that the United States has committed and that you're well aware of.
I agree.
So why would why wouldn't you want to impose, based on your own principles, why wouldn't you then want to impose punitive measures on the United States in order to punish them for their deeds?
Look, no, because I accept that the United States
you're a nationalist, and then it becomes very easy and clear. You're a team player. You're a team player. You support Australia's geostrategy globally, and you're hitting them with the humanitarian rights, the human rights punches, right? And you're playing your position.
Well, I don't support Australia's current I don't support Australia's current foreign policy, because I don't think it's focused on humanitarian aims at all. Like, it's focused on upholding the political aims of the United States, no matter whether that might be contrary to our interests or humanitarian principles.
It spouts a lot of humanitarian stuff.
But I agree with you. I will actually agree with you, Jay, that when the United States does that, a lot of the time it can't be trusted, because unfortunately...
but you want them to be Australia's nuclear umbrella.
Not necessarily.
Here. I mean, on the one hand, when it comes to China, you want to crash Australia's economy by stopping all business with them. Well, I mean, maybe not to that extent or something, right? But hurt the Australian economy somewhat. But when it comes to the United States, we need a nuclear umbrella, and you're not willing to think about sanctioning the United States or even censoring the United States at the United Nations or something like that, just to kind of assert ourselves as an independent country.
No, I accept your point. Honestly, probably the best long-term outcome, the best long-term course of action would probably be Australia developing its own nuclear deterrent, although that would sound crazy, and no one will agree with me. But it was something advocated recently by Hugh Wyatt, and that is probably the only thing that would allow Australia to have an independent...
The only time when you need to worry about Australia facing some nuclear threat from China is when China goes from being a productive, growing economy, which it is now, to being a debt-ridden zombie economy that lives on the exports of others by printing a fraudulent currency, in the way that the US is now. So when they get to that stage, then get nukes, whatever. But
as we speak,
they're peacefully integrating with Eurasia right now. Australia is soon going to be on the outskirts of this system, And we have the natural defenses of the sea as well. The only reason why Australia has ever been considered as a place to stash nuclear weapons was in order to play America's game against Russia and China.
I disagree that we're necessarily protected by the sea, because
the minute any country gets nuclear weapons, their status in the world goes up. I mean, it's just what it is.
It's a very difficult question, because obviously it would fucking lead to like a nuclear arms race with like Indonesia and like nuclear proliferation across Southeast Asia. That'd be horrible. I don't support that. It's difficult because Australia is always, I guess, trapped between the two superpowers, and it can't have an independent foreign policy.
You know, I know this sounds crazy, but like I'm someone who finds even guns disgusting, right? Like, I mean, as you get older, I mean,
You say?
Guns, right? I mean, you think these things were engineered to cause death and destruction. I mean, it just, you look at that and you think, you know, what is our species, right? I mean, you know, you feel intense shame. But then when you look at nuclear weapons, right, you're like, oh my god, this can destroy the entirety of life on Earth, and then you run the odds over and over again. You think, do we really have to do this? I'm just talking about getting some nuclear energy going, right? Not the uranium kind, but more of the Look up a guy named Reza Nezhad from University of Sydney. He's very good on this. So thorium nuclear power.
Real politics though. Real politic. If Australia were to abandon the US alliance, like, how would we like avoid becoming just a complete vassal of the Chinese state?
You don't have to abandon anyone, right? You don't even have to say anything negative. You just have to change your economic policies. Australia, it's just, what's completely mind-boggling is that Australia, in terms of natural resource wealth, is something like third in the world after Saudi Arabia and Canada, in terms of the amount of natural resources per capita. But Australia has deindustrialized despite all of this wealth. I mean, it's just, it's mind-boggling that we could have.
Yeah, it's sick.
That this could have happened to Australia.
I can't believe that like the Howard government and stuff allowed the resource boom to be just siphoned off by like overseas billionaires with 80%? Like no
80%.
Yeah,
Something
it's
like
sick because like
I remember Friendly
like
Geordie's
Norway
talking
has.
about it.
What'd you say?
I remember Friendly Geordie's talking about it. He said something like 80% of the resource wealth gets siphoned off.
Norway had a huge resource boom, and they were able to obtain like $1 trillion in national wealth and put that into like a sovereign wealth fund through it. And like by all estimates, like Australia's resource boom was magnitudes larger than Norway's resource boom. Yet we've got nothing to show for it, really. Like we don't have a sovereign wealth fund that like in any way compares to Norway's. Like,
what happens when you get convicts to run an economy, you know?
Yeah.
But like, no, it is absolutely shameful what's happening. I mean, the thing is, what prevents Australians from getting rebellious about this absolute economic catastrophe? What prevents us from getting rebellious?
Well, I think it's like
I've got an answer to this, but
we have such a concentrated media. Well, we have such a concentrated media.
Yeah. Well, what does the media pump out ideologically?
Like, obviously, like pro-neoliberal stuff in it.
Not just neoliberalism, but also Western exceptionalism, which is tied in with neoliberalism generally. But yeah, it's this belief that we are morally superior to all of the other countries in the world, right? And so what often happens is
I agree.
That when someone like yourself, when you, for example, get up and then you get on your moral high horse about China, this country that you want to break economic relations with, whereas you want the US as your nuclear umbrella for Australia, right? Like despite all of your honest intentions, like, you know, starting off on this, right? You end up serving you end up singing to the same tune, right? And from the same hymn sheet as Western exceptionalism. This idea that we're morally better than these other civilizations.
I disagree because I don't think that Australia is necessarily morally better.
Yeah,
my problem is that Australia doesn't give a fuck about the genocide, and because